In the last presentation on professional honesty, we drew a distinction between the obligation merely not to lie, a negative duty, and the positive responsibility to tell the truth. We noted that a healthcare professional displays his or her honesty not simply by avoiding lying or deception, but by telling the truth to patients. We noted that the professional obligation to tell the truth or to inform their patients is grounded in the principles of autonomy, beneficence, and fidelity. By providing patients truthful information about their situations and the therapeutic interventions proposed, healthcare professionals enable patient self-determination as required by autonomy. They promote a patient's ability to maintain control over their own lives and their health care. We also noted that truthfulness in the professional relationship, or truthful management of information, promotes productive therapeutic relationships. That is to say, it maximizes the potential that a patient's interactions with healthcare professionals will actually make them better off, as the principle of beneficence requires. Finally, of course, and derivative of both autonomy and beneficence, is the idea that the professional-patient relationship is a trust-based one. Patients have a legitimate expectation that their caregivers be truthful and trustworthy. These are the kinds of considerations to which the principle of fidelity points. In this presentation, we want to consider an idea that profoundly shapes modern medical practice, an idea that gives specific expression to the professional obligation to be honest. We're talking here about the idea of voluntary informed consent, which is sometimes shortened to simply informed consent, or IC. Voluntary informed consent refers to the idea or the belief or the commitment to the idea that medical interventions are morally valid if and only if an informed patient or their authorized surrogate gives voluntary consent based on understanding of relevant information relevant to the medical decision being made. Otherwise, those medical interventions are an inappropriate violation of the patient's rights. Recognizing that medical interventions are often intrusive and often do harm to patients, some have said that medical interventions in the absence of voluntary informed consent are actually assaults that violate the principle of non-maleficence. To understand informed consent, or voluntary informed consent, consider its basic elements as identified by Post and Bluestein on page 34. The first requirement for voluntary informed consent to be met is patient decisional capacity. We will look much more carefully at what this requirement involves, but for the time being, you can think of it simply as an assumption about most adult patients, that they have decisional capacity. They have a capacity or an ability to make decisions about their health care. If they don't, of course, it's impossible for them to govern their own lives or exercise self-determination. And so the worry about voluntary informed consent makes no sense unless you have a patient with decisional capacity. Secondly, voluntary informed consent requires disclosure by physicians and other healthcare professionals of sufficient relevant information. Again, we will look in more detail at this requirement in the future, but the basic idea is that healthcare professionals have the responsibility to truthfully inform the patients of all that they need to know to make a good decision about their health care. But it's not enough simply that patients be informed. It's not enough simply that healthcare professionals tell patients or provide information to patients that they need. Rather, as well, they must assure that the patient understands what they've been told. They must communicate often complex and difficult medical information in a way that's understandable to patients who don't necessarily have and are very likely unlikely to have the biological and the medical knowledge to understand. This obligation to communicate difficult and often complex medical information in a way that patients understand is one of the most difficult challenges faced by healthcare professionals in meeting their obligations to patients. And it often falls upon nurses and others who spend more time with patients than physicians do. It often falls upon nurses to guarantee that patients do in fact understand. It may even fall upon nurses and others besides physicians to put information that physicians have communicated in a way that patients can understand. Surely it's often nurses who are in a position to truly verify whether patients do in fact understand the information that's been communicated to them. Fourth, voluntary informed consent, as the word voluntary implies, suggests that the decisions that patients make must be truly voluntary. There must be no compulsion or coercion. A patient's consent is valid only if that consent is truly their own, truly voluntary. If they are compelled or coerced by the physician or by a family member to agree to a treatment or withdrawal of treatment, then their consent isn't really valid. It isn't a true expression of their own wishes. It is not truly an expression of patient self-determination. Finally, patients must be able to communicate to us their consent or their refusal to treatment. This is pretty obvious. And usually, of course, if a patient is able to understand complex information and make decisions, they will also be able to communicate their decisions to us. Though it is possible, of course, to imagine a situation in which a patient does understand and does have a capacity to make a decision, but simply can't communicate it to us. I've asked you to read a short essay from the President's Commission on Bioethics about the values underlying informed consent, or we might say the moral basis or the moral reasoning behind these informed consent requirements. What's interesting about what the President's Commission says is that they begin not with autonomy or patient self-determination as we might expect. Rather, they begin with the principle of beneficence or a concern about patient well-being. And their point is, in beginning there, is that medical interventions will not, in fact, truly promote patient welfare or not promote patient welfare as effectively as possible unless patients are fully involved in the decision-making about their care. Why is that the case? Well, according to the President's Commission, there in fact is quite often no objective or neutral medical basis for preferring one treatment plan or one treatment option over another. Often, various treatment options are equally effective or differently effective. And in such a situation, it's the patient's subjective values that are truly determinative for picking that option which best promotes that particular patient's welfare. So in fact, according to the President's Commission, if, as we generally assume, the very purpose of an interaction between patients and healthcare professionals or the healthcare industry is the promotion of patient welfare, we must include patients in decision making. We must meet the requirements of voluntary informed consent if those interactions are truly going to promote patient welfare effectively. Now, after those considerations related to beneficence, the President's Commission does turn to what we would expect, a concern about patient self-determination or considerations related to the principle of autonomy. But you should notice, and I hope you find interesting, this idea that the President's Commission offers, that the place to begin in thinking about why we must meet the requirements of voluntary informed consent is simply thinking about patient welfare or our obligations under the principle of beneficence. Post and Bluestein are very helpful in identifying and talking about a concern that many biomedical ethicists have about the actual practice of informed consent requirements in many medical settings. The concern is that healthcare professionals take a legalistic approach, an approach you might say that follows the letter of the law or the letter of informed consent requirements without actually honoring the spirit or the moral values, we might say, that underlie voluntary informed consent. Such an approach often involves simply asking, okay, what information must I disclose to the patient? The concern isn't to discern what of all that you might say to the patient is truly relevant to them and to their lives and their values and their decision, nor is the concern about whether or not the patient understands. The concern is simply, let's make sure we dump the information on the patient that voluntary informed consent requirements demand of us. That may well take the form of simply shoving some pamphlet or some sheet of paper with what is thought to be the relevant information in front of the patient. But again, no attempt to discern what that patient really wants to know, and no attempt to discern what his or her values are. Also, sometimes it seems that informed consent requirements in some medical settings are thought to be met simply by making sure that the proper forms are signed. Now, surely voluntary informed consent, like everything else in the medical context, must be documented. But simply having a patient's signature on a document does not, in fact, honor the process, honor the values toward which voluntary informed consent is meant to point. Such an approach seems designed primarily to avoid lawsuits. Notice this passage from Post and Bluestein on pages 39 and 40. They say, when it functions well, informed consent is not an event, a moment in time, a perfunctory discussion, or a signed document, but a process. Meaningful consent is voluntarily and knowledgeably given by the patient, not secured or imposed by the staff as part of an assignment. Consent is not something that a physician extracts from or does to the patient. Quote, you need to get consent from Mrs. Simon, or, quote, I consented, Mr. Thomas. This attitude violates the autonomy of the patient and makes the signed consent form a trophy rather than the documentation of a process of communication, education, understanding, and trust. Or consider this from the next page. The physician should begin the process by determining what the patient knows and whether he wants to participate in decisions about his care. Ongoing discussion should confirm his decisional capacity, his preferences and values, his appreciation of his condition, and the implication of his choices. The informed consent process thus assumes greater significance than simple physician disclosure of information and patient permission for treatment. It is an interaction between patient and physician, often including the family or trusted others, that promotes the exchange of relevant information and the provision of guidance and support that facilitates effective decision making. Now, I want to affirm everything that Post and Bluestein say here, but I also want to add that the emphasis is a bit too much on physicians, as if informed consent is exclusively a physician concern. As I've already said, it's very often nurses and other allied health personnel who are best placed to make sure that patients understand, best placed to discern patient values, best placed to discern whether or not the patient is truly engaged in this process. Notice In this context, in Post and Bluestein, they're concerned about language and the educational barriers to effective communication. It may well often be nurses, above all others, who are in the position to make sure those educational and language barriers are overcome in the informed consent process. One of the important aspects of voluntary informed consent is disclosure and understanding of, quote, sufficient relevant information, unquote. Post and Bluestein make 3 points about what sufficient relevant information might mean. First, and most obviously, they say that this refers to facts about the proposed diagnostic or therapeutic intervention, facts that patients typically consider relevant. Now, Post and Bluestein don't specifically use the language of benefits, burdens, and risks related to treatment, but many discussions of voluntary informed consent do. To make a good decision, patients need to know what benefits they might expect to derive from the intervention or therapy and what burdens are associated with it. What's the probability of various levels of benefit, and what's the probability that they will, or the risk that they will experience significant burdens related to the treatment. And of course, they need to understand the possibility and probabilities related to the progression of their disease. Secondly, they need to know the implications or the consequences related to alternatives to the proposed intervention, or even the consequences of non-intervention, of non-treatment. So as we've already seen, very often there are multiple treatment options. A truly valid informed consent will be based upon an understanding of information not simply about the therapy proposed, but about alternative therapies, and even about no therapy or no intervention. What will happen? What are the potential benefits and risks to me if we do nothing but let my disease or my injury take its course? And finally, they say that it's appropriate for physicians to make their specific recommendation as to what the patient should do. Some measure of appreciation here, I think, for the power imbalance between a knowledgeable healthcare professional in a context in which he or she is quite comfortable, and the power imbalance between that physician and a less informed, ill, anxious patient is appropriate. For some patients, their anxiety, their fear, their humiliation, the unfamiliarity of the medical or the hospital context in which they find themselves will lead to their forfeiting of all authority and control to the physician, or the forfeiting of their own self-determination, and a throwing of themselves entirely into the hands of physicians. Now, they surely have a right to do that, but healthcare professionals should be cautious in making recommendations and do their best to offer patients the opportunity to become competent and confident participants in decision making. So voluntary informed consent is obviously a very important requirement in the medical context, but you should notice the 3 exceptions that Post and Bluestein identify. The first is emergency situations. In situations where life and health are at profound risk, where time is of the essence, and where a patient is unable to participate in a timely fashion in decision making, one need not have voluntary informed consent to intervene to treat a patient to save their life. Secondly, they note rare situations where disclosure of information will in fact cause a patient, quote, imminent, direct, and significant harm, unquote. Now, notice they're talking about a psychologically or emotionally unstable person. And also recall the distinction that Post and Bluestein have made earlier between distress and true harm. Just because disclosing, for example, a possible risk associated with some treatment or some aspect of the patient's prognosis, just because that disclosure might cause distress. Post and Bluestein have warned that we should not assume that it will actually harm the patient. Distress is appropriate in the face of such difficult information, but that distress may not be truly harmful. However, there are situations, they imagine, in which it could be harmful to a highly unstable patient. In those situations, there is a justification for withholding information and having something less than informed consent. Finally, notice, of course, here Post and Bluestein's acknowledgement that patients do sometimes choose not to participate in decision making, and they surely have that right. Again, you should worry about the imbalance of power in the situation that will sometimes cause a weak and humiliated patient to too quickly abandon their capacity for self-determination and throw themselves into the hands of their healthcare providers. Okay, let's think a bit about decisional capacity. Remember, voluntary informed consent is only possible where one is in fact dealing with a patient who has decisional capacity. The first thing you should understand about this idea of decisional capacity is that it is a clinical determination about the actual abilities of the patient in front of me, and it's distinguishable from the legal determination of competence. Legal status, or a legal right to make decisions for oneself, may or may not correspond with a patient's actual capacity to do so. Our moral obligation is always to determine that actual decisional capacity. So what is the basis for a clinical determination that a patient, in fact, does have decisional capacity? A patient only has decisional capacity if she is able to understand and process or use and apply information about her diagnosis, prognosis, and various treatment options. That processing and using of information involves an ability to weigh the relative benefits, burdens, and risks of the treatment options before her. The patient must display an ability to truly compare the different packages of benefits, burdens, and risks associated with the various options. And in doing that comparing, to truly be decisional or to have decisional capacity, she must be able to apply her own values to that comparison. Her wants, her desires, her hopes, her fears are relevant to the decision before her and the weighing and comparing of the various options. Now, if a patient is inconsistent in their decision making, if they constantly change their minds or seem to be unable to make up their minds, expressing different judgments about the options before them from one day to the next or even 1 hour to the next, it may well be that they truly aren't capable of applying their own values as they attempt to compare the options before them and weigh their relative benefits, burdens, and risks, or that inability to make a decision or that constant wavering in the decision may reflect an inability to understand. Now, finally, of course, a patient must be able to communicate their decision, even if in some cases this only means a definitive nodding or shaking of the head. Listing the various aspects of decisional capacity like this seems simple enough. But in reality, determining decisional capacity is often quite complex. For one thing, as Post and Bluestein note, decisional capacity isn't global or universal or all comprehensive. Rather, it's decision specific. This means a person may have decisional capacity in relation to something like what to eat for dinner, but not with respect to other things, such as what's the best use of their money, how should they be investing their resources. Or they may be capable of deciding what to eat for dinner and how to invest their money, but not have decisional capacity when it comes to complex decisions about the therapeutic options in the face of a complex and developing disease. So decisional capacity is decision specific, not global or universal. A person doesn't simply have it or not have it. It depends upon the context. Moreover, decisional capacity fluctuates or changes. A patient may be lucid and sharp in their comprehension at some moments, and for a variety of reasons, debilitating pain, the effects of various drugs, completely lack that capacity or that comprehension at other moments. Now, one of the things that Post and Bluestein make clear is that the simple fact that a patient rejects or disagrees with a medical recommendation is not evidence in and of itself that a patient lacks decisional capacity. It may well be simply that in the context of their own lives and their own values, they weigh the relative benefits and burdens of the various treatment options differently than the way their physician or the healthcare professionals do. They have every right to do that, and simply disagreeing is not evidence that the patient lacks decisional capacity. Simply refusing a treatment that seems obviously best to the physician is not in and of itself evidence of a lack of decisional capacity. Having said that, when a patient does seem to be making choices that are wildly mistaken, it is appropriate to take care to assure that they truly have decisional capacity before we simply act on their decision, claiming that we are respecting their autonomy. No, if a person lacks decisional capacity, we don't respect their autonomy by following whatever judgment they make. Finally, Post and Bluestein note that because decisional capacity is complex and difficult to measure and is not global but decision specific, sometimes we will use a sliding scale. That is to say, we will recognize and acknowledge a patient's decisional capacity about relatively insignificant matters, like what to have for dinner, or whether to leave the shades open or closed, but not acknowledge their decisional capacity for making some life or death decision because of its greater complexity. Now, that might seem silly or inappropriate, but I think the idea here is that we do want to respect patient autonomy as broadly and to the degree that we are able, and to the degree that it's appropriate. So I mean, think about this. Just because we don't think a patient is necessarily capable of making a life and death decision, that does not mean that we should make all their decisions for them. We should enable them to maintain their dignity by participating as much as possible in those decisions that are less weighty, less significant, that also have to be made. Two issues arise when a patient lacks decisional capacity in relation to their medical decisions. The first is who decides for a patient who lacks such capacity. And the second is on what basis should decisions be made for another human being. Now, the first question is often fairly easy to resolve. If the patient has designated a proxy in their advance directive, that's the person then who has been authorized to make decisions for them. In honoring their decisions, we approximate an honoring of the patient's own self-determination and autonomy. In the absence of such an advance directive, the law often provides a hierarchy of proxy decision makers, beginning, of course, with the person's spouse, if they have one, or an elder child. So very often, there isn't a great deal of disagreement or uncertainty about who ought to be deciding for a patient that lacks decisional capacity. The more difficult matter is the basis upon which such decisions should be made. Now, clearly, if a person has an instructional advance directive that talks specifically about what treatments they would want or not want in a particular situation, then that is what should be followed. Those directives, those directions in an advance directive should be followed. Now, very often, however, advance directives turn out not to be quite so clear. Maybe the person has not specified or said anything about the particular treatment under consideration. Or maybe the situation in which they have said they would or would not want a particular treatment isn't exactly the situation we're in at this moment. And so we can't be confident that in making a decision for or against a particular treatment, we are actually doing what the patient wanted or would have wanted. In that situation, we often invoke what's called substituted judgment. While we don't know exactly what this patient's choice is or would have been in the situation we're facing, we do know something about their values. We do know something about the course of their lives. We do know something about the judgments that they have made in other situations. And so we substitute our judgment for theirs, attempting to apply the values and the commitments that we know this person has to the situation before us. Post and Bluestein don't like the language of substituted judgment. They refer to and prefer something called authenticity. They say what we're aspiring to here is a choice that is authentic in the context of this patient's values and their lives, something that's authentic to who they are. Now, what do we do if we don't have any knowledge of this person? They don't have an instructional advance directive that applies. We don't know very much, if anything, about their particular values or other decisions that they have made. How do we make decisions for a patient such as that? Well, here the standard is often called best interest. We try to make that decision which we think is in the best interest of this person simply as a human being, without any attempt to discern their particular values or their particular interests. Still, this standard is significant because it is suggesting a moral commitment to consider only the patient's interests and not some other considerations when making such decisions. Okay. Hopefully this has enabled you to have a deeper understanding of informed consent and a deeper understanding of the concrete requirements of honesty and truthfulness for healthcare professionals in the medical context. In a future presentation, we'll look at some of the other basic expectations that patients have at healthcare professionals, particularly those related to privacy and confidentiality. Those will be our concerns in the next presentation.